Good morning, I'm Dave Christie with your LaRouche organization update for Tuesday, August 19th. So obviously we're going to be discussing in large part the meeting that occurred yesterday in the White House between President Donald Trump, Vladimir Zelensky, and the European entourage that accompanied him, led by the British in terms of its outlook and intent of what they intended to do to sabotage that meeting. And that, of course, is to continue the long-standing policy of the British to destroy Russia, its influence in the Heartland region. This is the old Mackinder doctrine and so forth. But one of the key elements that they intended was to get a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine as a means to rearm its proxy and so forth. So now I'll cover some of those matters. We don't actually know what the final results of yesterday's meetings will be in terms of actual initiatives and policies and so forth. But what we know with the LaRouche organization and the leadership of Helga Zepp-LaRouche with the Schiller Institute is that we intend to use what occurred in Anchorage last Friday, the summit between Presidents Putin and Trump, to use that as a springboard for the outlook that, especially given that the meeting was in Alaska, that just across the Bering Strait from Alaska is, of course, Russia, and that link between Russia and the United States through the Bering Strait would be the means by which to integrate the sprawling initiatives of the Belt and Road project by the Chinese, which extends from Asia all the way over to effectively Africa and the continent of Africa, that we integrate that through the Bering Strait to achieve the long-standing vision of Lyndon and Helga Zepp-LaRouche, going back over 3 decades now, to bring the world into a world land bridge. And that's certainly the connection through the Bering Strait, connecting China's Belt and Road Initiative to the Americas would be the means to bring that vision to reality. So that would certainly be the importance of it. That would be important for the leaders of China, Russia, and the United States to discuss. And as Helga Zepp-LaRouche has called for, what better time to do that than the upcoming meeting that will be occurring on September 3rd in Beijing to honor the end of the Pacific theater of World War II, where both Putin and Xi Jinping will already be there, and certainly Trump's participation in that meeting would be important to discuss the kinds of principles that Helga Zepp-LaRouche has outlined in her 10 principles and her call for a true international development and security architecture. And I think that should be clear that there can be no peace, whether, coming out of the discussions yesterday and, of course, what occurred in Anchorage on Friday, there can be no long-standing peace without addressing the bankruptcy of the transatlantic system, as well as the need to move forward on a new economic model that integrates the world. Now, okay, so as far as yesterday and the coalition of the willing, as they call it, which seems like every time they use that moniker, that means millions of people are going to die. But that is what the Europeans, led by the British, choose to call their little organization to force Ukraine to continue the war. But in terms of what was discussed yesterday, I think the key point on at least the outcome so far is that Trump appears to remain committed to his stance that he had in the meeting with Vladimir Putin in Anchorage, namely that we do not need a ceasefire to continue the negotiations around a true and lasting settlement towards peace in the conflict in Ukraine. Now, the coalition of the willing has been steadfast in its commitment that they have to get a ceasefire first, again, to rearm Ukraine and keep the proxy war going. And of course, as the Russians have made clear and been unwavering, any sort of true and lasting peace requires a commitment that Ukraine will never join NATO, and that the present realities on the ground and the political developments that have occurred in the four regions, which of the Donbass and so forth, those four oblasts that have already voted to join the Russian Federation, that be accepted as a reality. And of course, the other conditions that Russia has consistently maintained is that there must be demilitarization so that the Ukrainian military cannot be used as a bulwark by NATO in future conflicts with Russia, as well as their call for denazification, which is the Bandera ideology that is now steeped into all aspects of Ukrainian society. Now, on the matter of the issue of Ukraine joining NATO, Trump had written the night before the meeting yesterday in the White House that he said that President Zelensky of Ukraine can end the war with Russia almost immediately if he wants to, or he can continue to fight. Remember how it started. No getting back Obama-given Crimea 12 years ago without a shot being fired, and no going into NATO by Ukraine. Some things never change. So it appears that Trump at least recognized the realities of that NATO, the calls for entry into NATO by Ukraine and supported by the others within the NATO structure, that was indeed one of the reasons for the outset of, or the launching by Russia of the special military operation. Now, on the question of a ceasefire as a precondition for any negotiations, again, something that the Coalition of the Willing has been calling for, as well as fellow neocon travelers in the U.S. like Keith Kellogg. Donald Trump said yesterday at the White House, "I don't think you need a ceasefire. We can work a deal where we are working on a peace deal while they're fighting. I'd like them to stop, but strategically that could be a disadvantage for one side of the other." Just to make the point on this, recall that at the end of 2022, after the war in Ukraine had been ongoing for nearly a year, Angela Merkel admitted that the first Minsk Accords were essentially negotiated with the idea by Merkel and others that this was being done so that Ukraine could be rearmed. That point was later made, or in the same time that Angela Merkel had made that point, others like Francois Hollande and Poroshenko, who were involved in the Minsk agreements, basically admitted the same. And then, of course, the other time that Russia had a cessation of hostilities, which was in the immediate, when they launched their drive to Kiev in the early days of the war, and then pulled back from that so that negotiations could ensue. Negotiations which actually led to a peace deal that was worked out at that time. And then, of course, as we well know, Boris Johnson of the UK went to Kiev and convinced Zelensky to back off the peace agreement and continued the war and the needless slaughter of hundreds of thousands, if not millions by now in this war. So Russia is not going to play the game of a ceasefire. They have made that clear, given the previous elements of betrayal. They especially are not going to go for a ceasefire when the military situation on the ground is moving forward rapidly, that the Ukrainian army is in the process of disintegration, which is the analysis of experts that know these matters. Now, as far as the Coalition of the Willing getting their way, Dmitry Medvedev took to social media yesterday. That is, he is the former president of Russia, currently deputy chair on the Security Council of the Russian Federation. What he said is the anti-Russian warmongering coalition of the willing failed to outplay the U.S. leader on his turf. This was on an X post yesterday by Medvedev. Europe thanked and sucked it up to him. And then went on to say that the question was what tune Zelensky would play about guarantees and territories back home once he's put on his green military uniform again. Of course, referencing the fact that Zelensky dressed up a little bit yesterday and got out of the battle fatigues and at least threw on a black suit or overcoat. On that note, NBC reports that Starmer was one of the key European officials who coached Zelensky on how to interact with Trump, that he's got to speak Trump and flatter the American president. Who knows if that's true? It certainly wouldn't surprise me that the British were coaching their actor for his role yesterday. I think importantly identifying the British role was a statement that came from the Russian Foreign Ministry through Maria Zakharova immediately preceding the meeting in the White House, where she cited or called out London's role in that they would work to sabotage the meeting yesterday in the White House. She cited the importance of what had occurred in Anchorage, which she called a fair and sustainable settlement of the conflict around Ukraine, including, among other things, the eradication of its root causes. And then she said statements continue to pour out of London that are not only dissonant with the efforts of Moscow and Washington, in terms of the peace negotiations in Anchorage. And then Zakharova said, but they are also clearly aimed at undermining them. And then she said that it referred to the coalition of the willing meeting that had occurred before the meeting in the White House yesterday, where she said that British Prime Minister Keir Starmer and Macron chaired that meeting and revived the obviously unviable idea of deploying a Western military contingent in Ukraine if an agreement on a ceasefire is reached. And then she said, in turn, on August 15th, British Defense Minister Healey directly stated that Albion, a reference to the British, was ready to send troops to Ukraine to support the ceasefire when it comes into force. Now, on that matter, Trump did cite, or had a Truth Social post following the meeting, where he won. Trump reported that following the outcomes of the meeting yesterday in the White House, and his dialogue with Vladimir Putin following that meeting, he said that a meeting at a location to be determined between President Trump and Zelensky. After that meeting takes place, we will have a trilat, which would be the two presidents plus myself. Now, I'll come back to that in a moment. But what Trump said is that there were a set of undefined security guarantees for Ukraine that would, quote, would be provided by the various European countries with coordination with the United States of America. Now, we don't know what that entails, but I think the Russians are not going to accept NATO-aligned nations to be on Ukrainian soil unless there are very secure reasons of why that is happening. So these we'll find out more on what those actual agreements look like, moreover on what the Russians would be willing to accept on this. Now, concerning what was reported, that Trump said that he had a meeting or that he had a phone call immediately following the discussion with the coalition of the willing. Bild Zeitung had actually reported that Trump left the meeting and went and had a 40-minute phone call with Trump. So with Putin, whatever that actually looks like. Either way, what the Kremlin statements on the results of that phone call, and assumedly the discussion of the idea of a trilateral meeting or a meeting between Putin and Zelensky, As for the Kremlin response to that, TASS reports that Ushakov certainly noted the importance of the Alaska summit, progress towards a peaceful solution to the Ukraine crisis that had been achieved there. He went on to say that in terms of the direct talks between the delegations of Ukraine, quote, they discussed the idea of considering the possibility of increasing the level of the Russian and Ukrainian representatives involved in the direct talks, but otherwise the two leaders agreed to maintain close contact on the Ukraine crisis and other pressing issues of the international and bilateral agenda. So Ushakov's mention of the possibility of increasing the level of the Russian and Ukrainian representatives involved in the direct talks does not imply an immediate openness to a trilateral meeting or a meeting between Putin and Zelensky. We'll have to see where some of this goes from here. Already, the French have jumped out to say, as Macron said, that perhaps Geneva could be a possible site of this supposed meeting between the Russians and the Ukrainians and the U.S. potentially. I doubt that, given Switzerland's abandonment of its neutral status during the conflict in Ukraine, I don't think the Russians would be excited about that. But either way, we're in the middle of determining where this goes. From the direction of Anchorage, it's at least important that so far Trump has not gone along with the idea of the ceasefire as a means to rearm Ukraine, as the coalition of the willing clearly intended. But we have to determine what the path towards peace is in terms of a development perspective again. Now, on other matters of war and peace, whereas Trump, appears to be moving in a better direction concerning Russia. Unfortunately, yesterday, surrounding the crisis in Gaza, Trump essentially gave a green light to the Netanyahu genocidal regime on the plan to occupy Gaza. He had a Truth Social post saying that we will only see the return of the remaining hostages when Hamas is confronted and destroyed. The sooner this takes place, the better the chances of success will be. He goes on to say that he was the one that negotiated and got hundreds of hostages freed and released into Israel and America. He was the one that ended the 6 wars in 6 months, obliterated Iran's nuclear facilities, play to win or don't play at all. Thank you for your attention to this matter. So that's not helpful for the situation there and the millions of Gazans that are threatened with starvation and so forth. Now, on that matter, the Helga Tsepp-LaRouche and the Schiller Institute are initiating calls and exploration of how the Uniting for Peace formula can be used at the UN. This is where the UN General Assembly can take a vote on important matters and force certain actions. So we're going to be looking into more of that, and that's obviously in the context of the upcoming UN meeting. Stay tuned to the LaRouche Organization and the Schiller Institute. But in terms of the other important initiative that Helga Tsepp-LaRouche has called for, namely the far more important trilateral meeting than we've discussed in this so far, which is the meeting between President Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, and Donald Trump. And the perfect venue for that would be the upcoming meeting on September 3rd in Beijing. Again, that celebrates or commemorates the ending of World War II. And of course, immediately after that is the Eastern Economic Forum in Vladivostok. And that would be an important forum to discuss the relevance of the Bering Strait connection, again, to realize the reality of the world land bridge that Lyndon and Helga Tsepp-LaRouche had called for many decades ago. So I think that's our perspective. We are mobilizing on that, as well as the matters I mentioned concerning the upcoming summit regarding the stopping the genocide in Gaza. And so stay tuned to the LaRouche organization for those developments and mobilize